Yo, what's going on YouTube, and welcome back to Goal Line Hockey. It's your boy Kevin Forte, and today we have a very exciting video for you guys, as it is officially our NHL preseason rankings going into the 2022-23 NHL season. This is, at least for the foreseeable future, the last pre-recorded power rankings we are going to have, because going into this season, I am proud to announce every Friday at 10 a.m. Eastern, we are going to have a live Goal Line Hockey power ranking. So stay tuned for that during the regular season. Like I said, every Friday, weekly at 10 a.m. Eastern time. So stay tuned for that during the regular season. But with that said, let's get into our preseason power rankings. So we're going to start off looking from at number 32, which is the team that I have at last place, and moving our way up more toward the positive side of things up to number 1. And I don't think number 32 will surprise any of you. At number 32 is the Chicago Blackhawks. We're starting off this list. Yeah, the Blackhawks, listen, I have to say their goaltending tandem is probably one of the worst, if not the worst, in the National Hockey League, and it's hard for me to have them any further up than 32. Chicago is in a full rebuild. You've got Taves and Kane still there, but the morale of this team is not going to be there. This is not the team that we saw winning Stanley Cups in the mid-2010s. That's no longer the case. A completely new goalie tandem. Kevin Lankinen's gone. Peter Mrazek comes in. I'm not sold on that group. I think the Blackhawks will be toward the bottom, if not last, in the NHL standings. Number 31, the Montreal Canadiens. Montreal Canadiens, listen, my Habs fans, you guys are pretty realistic with the fact that the Habs are not a playoff team, and I think that's pretty well known throughout the league. They're in a full rebuild. There is optimism there. You're seeing new guys like Kirby Dach, Juraj Slafkovsky probably making the roster this season, so I think there's hope for the Montreal Canadiens. But again, with Carey Price missing this season, potentially for the entirety of this season, I just don't think the Habs have what it takes in between the pipes. I think there's a lot of younger players on the blue line and up front. I just don't think Montreal has enough scoring talent that is going to be ready next season, and that's why I have them starting this season at 31. Moving up to number 30 is the Philadelphia Flyers. We're heading to the Metropolitan Division for this one. Yeah, the Flyers are dead last in the Metro, at least to start this season. I think they're going to be the one outlier in terms of this division that will not really be competitive. I think the Flyers, even John Tortorella said it the other day, he's not a fan of this team, the locker room, just the overall morale of this team, and I think this team is going to struggle. There's a lot of questions up front, on the back end, and in between the pipes. So there's really no stability throughout this roster, and it kind of leaves you wondering who's going to score the goals for this team consistently. Who's going to be your top D-man other than Provorov? Because we saw Provorov can play. He's a good defenseman, but he was overplayed last season for the Flyers, and it ended up hurting his game. So one of the few good defensemen on the Flyers ended up having a bad season because he was just out there too much. And I worry that could happen again this season. Same thing, could they potentially hurt the development of a guy like Cam York? There's a lot of questions there. How many goals can a guy like Owen Tippett put in this year? Can guys like Coots, James Van Riemsdyk, can those guys stay healthy? Same for Joel Farabee. All three of those guys I just mentioned were out for significant portions last season due to injury. Remember, they're going to start the season now. They're going to play a full 82-game schedule without Claude Giroux, who left the team at the trade deadline. So it's going to be interesting to see what Tortorella does here in training camp, if he could get some kind of spark out of this team. But I definitely have my concerns about the Flyers, not to mention Kevin Hayes, who also missed time last year for the Flyers. At number 29, the Arizona Coyotes. The Arizona Coyotes playing in the brand new ASU Arena. Very exciting to see them playing at Mullet Arena. I think that's what it's called. But I think this is going to be a rough year for the Yotes. I have them having the worst goalie tandem going into this season. Make sure to check back that video. Little plug to that. But the Coyotes just aren't there. And I think there is signs of improvement. I think you see some of the younger guys coming in, like Dylan Gunther, as well as some of the guys that we maybe have seen over the last couple of years continue to be decent players, but just not good enough to be a playoff team. Yes, they still have Jacob Chikrin. Shane Gostisbehere is pretty good on the blue line as well. And then you've got, like I said, some of those younger players. Keller can score 20 to 30 goals. I think that's going to continue. Nick Schmaltz had a pretty good season last year. As long as he could stay healthy, he could be a really good centerpiece there. So, the Coyotes have some potential. I just don't think they're in a good enough... Again, they're in a weaker division in the Pacific, but that division did get better, I think. And I just don't think they're going to be able to handle what's in front of them. Number 28, we're staying in the Pacific, and we're going a little bit south, a little bit north, actually, and that is San Jose. So the San Jose Sharks are at number 28 here. I'm not a fan of the way the Sharks are looking right now. Yes, they've got some core players, which keeps them from maybe some of these bottom feeders. They've got some guys like Timo Meier at the making of this video, Logan Couture, Tomas Hertl. But I'm still a little bit suspect on that defense. Carlson, Burns, Vlasic, those guys really struggled last year. So I'm hoping to see maybe a little bit of a more structured defense with, a new coach in there and Rangers former head coach David Quinn. So hopefully that'll change things up a little bit. But this is a developmental team right now. The goaltending is, I think, a weakness for this team with James Reimer and Adin Hill. I don't know. Adin Hill is in Vegas now. So, I don't know. I'm thinking right now, I just don't think the Sharks' defense is good enough. And you could say that's a maybe strength. But I just don't think there's enough depth there. And this, like I said, with, Arizona in their division, in the Central, I just don't think they could stack up well in the Pacific. And I think that's why San Jose is kind of going to fall under that same umbrella here. And number 27 is the Dallas Stars. Yeah, the Dallas Stars... I hate to say it, the only real positives they have are Maro Heiskanen, Jason Robertson, if they could get him re-signed, and Jay Gottinger. Now, that's the optimism in Dallas. But there's a lot of things that aren't good about this team. We got to see some prolific goal scoring. I think they're a team that it just hasn't been consistent enough from the big boys. And even their ownership has come out numerous times, year after year, talking about Jamie Benn, Tyler Seguin. Why aren't we getting more production from those guys, right? That has to improve if the Dallas Stars are going to be able to compete in a pretty difficult division. It's very top-heavy, but I just don't think Dallas is one of those teams. Ottinger's going to keep them in some games and win them some games, but even with that, he's not going to be able to score goals. And at the end of the day, that's what Dallas has been lacking the last couple of years. They've had Ben Bishop. They've had Anton Khudobin. They've had some good goaltenders, but they can't put the puck in the back of the net. And I do worry that they could do that this year. Mason Marchment hopefully comes in and puts up 30, 35 goals this year. But again, you're asking for a lot, and I just don't know if Dallas is going to be there. So we'll see what happens, but my optimism is kind of tempered down in the Lone Star State in Dallas. Number 26, the Buffalo Sabres. We're going to see some improvement in Buffalo this season, but unfortunately, like I've mentioned with some of these other teams, they haven't improved enough to keep up with the arms race of the other teams that were around their same spot last year in their division. Ottawa got a lot better, right? Boston got a lot better, you can argue, with just bringing back guys like Krejci and Bergeron. I just don't think that as good as Buffalo will probably improve this year with a full season of Owen Power, seeing some of those younger guys playing, I just think it's going to be another developmental year. Their goaltending isn't that great with Anderson and Comrie, but there is going to be optimism. You're going to see a little bit of Ukko-Pekka Luukkonen probably down the stretch. And again, a full season of Owen Power, JJ Paterka, Jack Quinn. There's optimism there, but it's going to be a continual process. And this is, I know Buffalo Sabres fans are sick of hearing that playoff drought. What is it, 22 years or 12 years? It's something like that. It's the longest playoff drought in the NHL right now. I do unfortunately think that's going to continue this year, but again, it's patience. And I know Sabres fans don't want to hear that, but I see them moving forward this season and improving off of where they finished last year. Number 25, my team on the West Coast, the Anaheim Ducks. Yeah, the Anaheim Ducks had a pretty good season last year, but I would temper those expectations. They're going to have a full season without one of their better shutdown defensemen in Josh Manson, who they traded at the deadline. I think that really hurt them down the stretch. Losing a guy like Nicolas Delorier as well, again, I think that hurt them a little bit. But they did bring in some new guys. New additions like Ryan Strome and Frank Vetrano, both from the New York Rangers, I think are welcome additions for this team. I do worry about John Gibson a little bit. This is a big year for him. He had really low numbers last season, so is it more of a mental thing? Or is it that the team just in front of him hasn't been that good? I think it's a combination of both. Gibby has to be back on his game in Anaheim because I think the Ducks are going to be in for a tough season. I think Seattle got a lot better this season. You're looking at a couple of teams there on the West Coast where I don't think Anaheim is going to be improved enough to keep up with some of those other big dogs, but I can see slight improvement there. So we'll see what happens. I don't have them making the playoffs, but I do think they will be around where they were last season. Don't forget that kid Mason McTavish, a really talented center. A lot of people are kind of down on him. You know, I was saying that he might end up being better than Trevor Zegras. Keep an eye out for that. Maybe not this year, but maybe as soon as next year or 2 years from now. Keep an eye out for that guy McTavish. We'll see what happens there. Number 24 is the Seattle Kraken. So the Seattle Kraken, what's weird about the Kraken is their goaltending was not very good last year, and I keep bringing that point up. But they have a new goalie coach there, same tandem, Grubauer and Drieger, and I think as long as they could stay healthy and just put up 9-10 save percentage numbers, I think Seattle's going to be right in the mix. I think when you look at Seattle, a very underrated improvement to their team was their winger core, right? They really lacked wingers last year and scoring depth. That won't necessarily be the case this season. On the back end, they added Justin Schultz, who I think is a very welcome addition. They also brought in some guys like Oliver Bjorkstrand from Columbus. Really great addition there. Andre Burakovsky from the Stanley Cup champion Colorado Avalanche. I really like what Seattle did this summer. I don't have them making the playoffs, unfortunately, but I think their improvements are going to make things very interesting in that Pacific Division. You want to talk about a wild card team that could be in the mix? It could be the Seattle Kraken. If that goaltending is good enough and that defensive structure that Dave Haxtell, there's enough buy-in, keep an eye out for the Seattle Kraken there. Number 23. This one might surprise some people, but the Vegas Golden Knights. Now, I kind of have to make my case here because a lot of people will say, well, can't Vegas maybe win the division? I'm not a fan of Vegas here. I think they've got some good players, but it doesn't matter if there's not a buy-in to what you're doing, and I think that is a struggle for Vegas. Nick Hague even said during training camp, it doesn't seem like there's very good communication. All signs are pointing to this maybe being a turmoil season in Vegas. It's already been a weird summer with the PR, with Pacioretty kind of getting burned on his way out, Marc-Andre Fleury in the spring getting burned on his way out. You know, it just seems like Vegas has had a lot of turnover and not a lot of communication, not a ton of buy-in and patience. And I wonder if that's going to catch up to them this season. They're going to start the season without their starting goalie, Robin Lehner, potentially without Laurent Brossoit as well. We might be seeing a start to the season where they have potentially Logan Thompson and Aiden Hill as their starting goalie tandem. So we'll see how things work out. But as of right now, I definitely have concerns about the Vegas Golden Knights potentially falling way out of the playoffs. They do have a new coach there in Bruce Cassidy. Hopefully that makes enough of a difference. But as of today, not a huge fan of what I've seen from the Golden Knights. Number 22, kind of interesting as we're staying in that Western Conference Pacific Division here, and that is the Vancouver Canucks. So the Vancouver Canucks, I think, are a still pretty decent team, but there's still things that have to get improved, specifically the back end. I like some of their forwards right now. They've got young guys like Vasily Podkolzin and Niels Höglander, but there's a lot of questions around some guys like Brock Besser. You know, is Bo Horvat going to re-sign? Does that become a distraction, especially in a big city like Vancouver? I wonder how things are going to play out in that scenario, but I do like the goaltending. Thatcher Demko and Spencer Martin could end up being a top 10 goalie tandem by the end of this season. Demko has proven that he can steal games for the Canucks, and in that division, again, if Vegas and Seattle and Anaheim are below, you know, that team there in Vancouver, they could make an argument to maybe making the playoffs and potentially stealing a wild card spot. So I think they're going to be right on the cusp of either just missing or just making the playoffs in Vancouver. Let's see if Bruce Boudreau's buy-in continues for another season. I think that's going to be the most interesting thing, as they did re-up his contract. JT Miller's there for the long haul. They bought into that, so hopefully that pays off. Those are all the things that we need to see develop this season in Vancouver. Number 21, heading to the East Coast as we're moving to the other side of the continent, and we're looking at the New Jersey Devils. So the Devils are at 21. I'm not buying the juice in New Jersey this season. I've bought that juice the last 2 or 3 years, and it's always come up empty for me. Until the Devils can prove to me that they can beat those better teams in the Metropolitan Division, like Carolina and the Rangers, Pittsburgh, and even the New York Islanders, I don't think they're going to be able to get anything done. And those are 4 teams. You could even argue Columbus is better than the Devils. So I just don't think New Jersey has the goaltending. That is my biggest concern in New Jersey, because it seems like they have 5 goaltenders there that can play any given night. You've got Jonathan Bernier, Nico Dawes, Mackenzie Blackwood, Vitek Vanacek. It's just a mess. And I think that their biggest problem is the goaltending. They do have a lot of good depth, though, right? They've added some pretty good players. Andre Palat, the newest forward addition to that group. They made some trades. They brought in John Marino from Pittsburgh, sent out Ty Smith. They've made some interesting moves, but I just don't think New Jersey fixed the biggest issue last year, which was the goaltending, and I think it could end up hurting them again this year. We'll see what happens. Hopefully Blackwood comes home. He's healthy. He's ready to go, and things are good for them. But I'm not necessarily confident in that. I've heard that story before, and I'm not buying it this year. Speaking of staying in the Metropolitan Division, at 20, it's the Columbus Blue Jackets. The Blue Jackets look like a pretty solid team, but again, there's some questions there as well. Their goalie tandem wasn't necessarily that good last year in Korpisalo and Merzlikins. They had a down season compared to what we're used to with that tandem. A really good tandem on a normal season. It just didn't work last year. I do expect their numbers to be back to their normal selves, which is good enough to keep them in the race for the playoffs, kind of like they were this past season. They obviously added some pretty big additions up front and on the back end from Calgary, bringing in Eric Goodbranson, who is a great shutdown, penalty-killing defenseman, as well as obviously the exact opposite of that up front in Johnny Hockey Gaudreau. So they're going to get some more scoring there. It's going to open up the ice and maybe give a little bit more of separation for Patrick Laine, because he's not the number one focus for other teams' opposition. He doesn't get those number one matchups. That'll be for Johnny Gaudreau to deal with, and I think that's going to allow Laine to actually benefit and probably put up some more goals next season. So I think that Columbus is going to be better, but again, that division is just so tight and so difficult. I do think it's going to be a struggle for them once again next season. I do like some of those guys there that they have in Columbus, but again, I just wonder about their depth. Is it good enough? Number 19, the Winnipeg Jets. So the Winnipeg Jets defense looked like it was going to be better last year, and this is a team almost like New Jersey, except they don't keep making moves. Winnipeg is just unapologetically stable, which is, Jets fans are almost frustrated that they haven't shaken up the core at all over the last couple of years. 2020 was their last real season of success, and they just haven't gotten back to that. But they've been so concerned about keeping that group the same. Really, the last major move they made was trading out Jacob Trouba and Patrick Laine, right? And obviously bringing in Dubois in that Laine trade. So, Winnipeg has been eerily quiet the last couple of years with Wheeler, Scheifele, and Dubois as well. All those guys, some of them on contract years. You just wonder if things could blow up in Winnipeg this year. I do see that happening, potentially at the trade deadline, if not next summer. And I just don't think Winnipeg is there. They didn't make any additions for me to believe that in that Central Division they can make the playoffs. Like I said, their team is good enough to make things interesting. Ultimately, though, I do think they will come up short. So we'll see what happens there. Number 18, heading back to the East Coast, the Ottawa Senators. So the Ottawa Senators, shout out to Ali Desch. That's his team. The Ottawa Senators look a lot better this season. One of the most improved teams this offseason. Obviously, bringing in Alex DeBrincat, the cap from the Chicago Blackhawks, huge addition for them there. Tim Stutzla signs his big-ticket contract, hoping for a point-per-game season from him. And Cam Talbot, I think, is one of the most underrated pickups this offseason. Everybody kind of swept that one under the rug. You know, Fleury's the starter in Minnesota. Cam Talbot gets traded. Whatever. He was in the conversation for winning the Vezina Trophy for one of the best goalies in the league at one point this season. And ultimately led to him being the all-star pick for the Minnesota Wild this past season. So Ottawa gets a really good goalie. Anton Forsberg as well. Pretty good backup. I think Ottawa is due for a really good run this year. I do ultimately think they come up short. Watch for that kid, Jake Sanderson. He is going to be really good. A lot of people have compared him to a couple of years ago, prime Erik Karlsson. So if he's anything like that, keep an eye out for the former University of North Dakota product, Jake Sanderson. Number 17. The Minnesota Wild. So the Minnesota Wild, speaking of Cam Talbot, Marc-Andre Fleury is the starter there. I really like what Minnesota has, but I'm not necessarily as sold on them as I was at the beginning of the offseason. You know, I am tempering my expectations. The only real guy that they lost other than Talbot was Kevin Fiala. And he didn't really produce for them in the playoffs, so it wasn't that big of a loss. It just means they need more scoring by committee by some of the other guys on this team. Jordan Greenway, Matt Boldy, Joel Eriksson-Ek. I think this team has the talent to stay competitive, but that's a tough Central Division. And I see Minnesota as a border team in that division because the other three teams are just really good. And I just don't know if Minnesota has been able to keep up with those other dogs in their division. I see them in the same territory as Winnipeg as kind of a maybe in, maybe out, kind of a wild card team. But I do think Minnesota will ultimately make the playoffs, but it's definitely going to make things interesting there in the Western Conference. So now we move up into the top 16, and hypothetically, these are playoff teams, but I do have more Eastern Conference teams in the top 16, so bear that in mind. But at number 16 is the Detroit Red Wings. I think the Red Wings made a lot of additions this summer. Steve Yzerman went all in this year, and I think he was tired of what happened at the end of last season. The team looked dead and just out of it. That's part of the reason Blashill no longer has a job in Hockeytown. You know, the Red Wings really made a couple of additions that doesn't seem like the huge addition, the sexy guy, but it's the guy that's going to help them win next year. Andrew Kopp, a great top six center, formerly played at the University of Michigan I think he was a captain of the Wolverines, or at the very least played there for a couple of seasons. Really good hockey player there, so he's returning. Again, now you've got Larkin and Kopp, former Wolverines, which I think is pretty cool. Obviously, you get the additions on the back end. You bring in Ben Sherratt, who's going to be a great mentor for Moritz Seider. Great complimentary piece there. Ville Husso in between the pipes. You know, even a guy like David Perron, who I think was a very underrated signing. The Red Wings just got good complementary pieces, and I think those are guys that are going to allow them to probably make the playoffs this year. I really do think that. They're going to make Boston really work for a playoff spot in the Atlantic Division, but I think this is going to be a really interesting group in Detroit to watch for, because I think if they start off the season hot and playing really well, I would really keep an eye out for them. But again, their concern is the goaltending. That's one thing I am not sold on. Husso, is he really as good as he was last year, or is he the goalie we've seen for the past 4 seasons prior to that last season, where he wasn't very good? And 2 years ago, we were talking about, is Husso even good enough to be a backup in the NHL? He had a really bad season in St. Louis, so is last year's charm going to continue, or did he get that big ticket and maybe things kind of slack off this summer into this season? Guess we won't know till next season. But that will be very interesting to watch for. I'll also shoot out there for Alex Nedeljkovic or Nedeljkovic, whatever you want to call him. I'm sure my Red Wings fans will let me know. But this will be really interesting to see how the Red Wings season kind of plays out. Number 15 is the Washington Capitals. And the Capitals, I'm really kind of in a weird spot with them, because you look at how many guys are injured to start this season and won't be there to start on opening night. Tom Wilson might not be there. We know Carl Hagelin, Nick Backstrom will not be there either. A lot of concerns in Washington, and I just really am looking at the Caps right now and asking myself, do they have enough depth? And I'm sitting here today and I don't know. You know, you're going to see a lot more of the younger guys. Marcus Johansson, they basically had to re-sign him. Connor McMichael comes in, Axel Janssen, Fialbi. You're going to see more of those guys playing. Dylan Strome, also a new addition in Washington. And then obviously your goalie tandem of Lindgren and Darcy Kemper. I'm just not sold on Kemper as a starting goalie. Lindgren is a good backup, but if he has to play 30-plus games next year because Kemper just isn't there, I think this is more of a lack of defensive depth for Washington and not necessarily the goalies. It's just a combination of both. So I wonder if Washington will make the playoffs next year. It's going to be interesting. Again, when you have Detroit and Ottawa and Columbus and New Jersey behind you, Washington really cannot afford to come out of the gate those first dozen games and struggle, because that could be the difference come game 81, 82 of the season if they make the playoffs or not. So definitely something to watch for there in the Eastern Conference. Number 14, we're staying in the Metropolitan Division, and that is the New York Islanders. Listen, call me biased, call me whatever you want, but the Islanders are another swing team. If the defensive structure stays the same with Lane Lambert and the team buys in the way they did with Barry Trotz, the Islanders are going to make some noise next season. Obviously, the complaint with the Islanders is they have lack of goal scoring, and that's been a concern for the Islanders for a long time now. But the Islanders' big thing that really helps them is, I mean, you can make a real argument. They have the best goalie tandem in the National Hockey League. And again, complimenting back to that goalie tandem video I made a couple days ago, make sure to check that out if you didn't. But the Islanders, listen, I always say, the saying is defense wins championships. I absolutely agree with that. But goalies steal games during the regular season and sometimes even the playoffs. So goalies steal games, defense wins championships. You have that powerful combo, you become the Tampa Bay Lightning, and look at what they're doing. So I think if the Islanders can get at least one of those down, if they can steal games with Sorokin and Varlamov, the Islanders are going to be really good next year. And let's see if the defense can win them a championship or two. We'll see. Tempering my expectations, I'll settle for playoffs next year for the Islanders, but I think that's going to be really an interesting story to watch. A lot of people are not sold on the Islanders. Listen, they had a bad season last year, so we'll see how things play back next year. Number 13, the Pittsburgh Penguins. This is the opposite of the New Jersey Devils, because normally I flip-flop the Devils and Penguins over the last 2 or 3 years. This is the year that the Devils will turn it on and they'll get things going. This is the year Pittsburgh's going to fall off. I'm sick of saying that, so we're flipping it. This year is going to be the year where I say New Jersey, yes, they are not going to make it. I'm not buying the hype again this offseason. They win the offseason, congrats, but they can't win on the ice during the regular season. It's the opposite for Pittsburgh. I'm not doubting Crosby and Malkin anymore. I've done it the last 2 years. I've said, is this the year Pittsburgh finally misses the playoffs? I'm not buying it. I've said that about Pittsburgh and Washington for a while. If I had to choose one or the other to miss the playoffs, I would definitely have Washington missing the playoffs over Pittsburgh. But Malkin and Crosby, I mean, those two are together again. Letang stays. If he could stay healthy, I'm kind of giving up on Dumoulin being healthy, because you could pretty much bargain he'll be out at least 30 or 40 games every season. So Pittsburgh, as long as they could keep Malkin and Crosby healthy and get the depth scoring from so good of a player like Jake Gensel, he is an Islander killer. He scores hat tricks or 4-goal games every time he plays the Islanders. So as long as Gensel stays healthy and Crosby and Malkin and the rest of that group, the Penguins are always going to be a threat in the Metropolitan Division. I think that continues this season as well. Number 12, the Boston Bruins. So we're heading back to the Atlantic Division, and I think Boston is a very good team still. I like Fitzgerald coming in to be the head coach there. I think that the Bruins right now, I like that goalie tandem. Ullmark and Swayman worked so good last year. I expect that to continue for the Bruins. Their defense looks still pretty... there's some questions there with guys like Forbert I'm not sold on, or who's the other guy? I think his name is Riley. Is it Mike Riley? Did he return? Yeah, Mike Riley. I don't know. I'm not a huge fan of those guys, but listen, Hampus Lindholm came in. I think that was a huge addition for them. Their top four is really good with McAvoy, Lindholm, Carlo, and Grizzy. With Grizzlick, I really like that group. It's so fitting that Grizzlick plays in Boston, right? But I think that's a really good fit for the Bruins. And again, Krejci coming back, I think, is a really good locker room guy and a good mentor. And again, allows guys like Studnicka to develop a little bit more and not force them into a top six center role, which I think is huge. You also bring in Pavel Zacha. Great offseason for the Bruins. Again, didn't take any of those big guys that we've been talking about this summer, but they didn't have to, right? Just bringing back Bergeron and Krejci, I think that's more than enough for the Bruins to probably get back to the playoffs. Number 11, we're heading back to the West Coast, and that is the Nashville Predators. Really the Midwest, not necessarily the West Coast. You get what I mean. The Western Conference. The Nashville Predators are at number 11. I think Nashville is due for a great season this year. Ryan McDonagh was the key addition this offseason for them. Obviously, Forsberg returning is huge as well. A lot of people are sleeping on Nashville. You know, if they had not played Colorado in the playoffs next year, they might have beaten Calgary. They might have beaten Edmonton. As crazy as that sounds, keep an eye out for Nashville next year. They might surprise some people with how good they are. I'm not a huge fan of John Hines still. I don't want to put them at the top of the division. But this is a team I think will make the playoffs, and I just like some of their guys. If they could just score some freaking goals from guys like Duchesne, Forsberg, again, if I could see anything from Johansson, this team's going to be really good. You talk about that blue line. I mean, we talked about their blue line a couple years ago during those conference final runs and cup final runs. It's similar to that this year with McDonagh coming in, right? You've got Ekholm, Yossi, McDonagh. What's the other guy's name? I'm trying to remember. It starts with an A. It's killing me. You guys are going to scream it in the video. Of course, now I can't find Nashville. Not Fabro. Alex Carrier, that's his name, who has been very good. And again, if Dante Fabro can get just a little bit better, this team is going to be a juggernaut. And listen, I said defense wins championships, and they've also got the goalie too, Juice. Shout out to UC Saros, who had an incredible year. Definitely keep an eye out there for Nashville. So now we move up to the top 10, and if you stuck out this long, guys, thank you so much for watching this video. It means a lot. The Los Angeles Kings. The Los Angeles Kings have been really good offseason once again for them. They bring in Kevin Fiala. So Fiala and Arvidsson, former Predators, now on the West Coast in LA. Really like what the Kings have done. They really haven't needed to make the big sexy moves as well. They've already got good players. A little bit more development from Byfield, hopefully, in the offseason. Guys like Turcotte, Kaliev. Maybe we see Brant Clark next season. Again, it's a bit of a stretch. That's a pretty packed blue line. Mikey Anderson, Drew Doughty, really good blue line there in LA. I think as long as the goaltending with Quick and Cal Peterson can be somewhat pretty much as good as they were last year, they're going to be just fine. I think competing very much at the top of that Pacific Division. But of course, there's those two teams in Alberta that they're going to have to deal with, and I think that could end up being their Achilles heel. We'll see what happens there. Number 9, a team that kind of went down, the Florida Panthers. Listen, Florida really kind of messed with me. I had them winning the Stanley Cup last year with Giroux coming in and Sherratt. They no longer have those guys, so it's going to be a lot more on the Tkachuk show, right? Matthew Tkachuk comes in from Calgary. It did come at a cost. Wieger is gone. Huberdeau is gone. So this is kind of a big move for the Florida Panthers, and they're going to be relying more on their depth. And I do think the Florida Panthers are still a great team with Spencer Knight and Sergei Bobrovsky, but that depth and that defense definitely took a hit. So we'll see what happens here. I think that Florida is still definitely a playoff team, definitely a team that could be competing at the top of that division. But there are some good teams in that division, and I just don't think they are in the top 2 necessarily at this point. So I have them at number 3, respectively. Number 8, the St. Louis Blues. So we're heading back to the Midwest, and the St. Louis Blues, I am really buying into the goalie group of Thomas Greiss and Jordan Binnington. Binnington has to get better. He has to get back to that 2019 form, because if not, this is going to be another rough year for the Blues. I think their team overall is very good. Good blue line, good forward group. I mean, you look, that I think they kind of star-powered their way past the Minnesota Wild in the first round, right? They just had so much talent up front. Ryan O'Reilly, Tarasenko, Shen, Buchnevich came in last year. Jordan Kyrou had an incredible season. Robert Thomas, shout out to his big extension that kicks in next year. On the blue line, one of the best blue lines in the league. Justin Falk, Torrey Krug, Parayko, and then some of the depth guys, Mikola, Bortuzzo, Scandella, Leddy. A really good group there. It comes down to the goaltending. That is my biggest concern for the St. Louis Blues. If that goaltending tandem can hold out, watch out for the St. Louis Blues next year. They've got the talent, they've got the scoring, they've got the blue line, and they've got the head coach in Berube. As long as they buy in, I think it's going to be another successful year in St. Louis. So now we move to number 7, and yeah, this kills me as an Islanders fan, but the New York Rangers are at number 7. Now, this might surprise some people. Some people might be saying, well, they're too low or they're too high up. So I do think they're maybe not necessarily Eastern Conference level. Again, there's always that opportunity. But as of right now, the Rangers did lose some pieces. They did bring in Vincent Trocheck, and Yaroslav Halak will be in between the pipes now behind Igor Shesterkin. Obviously, Shesterkin comes back. Huge pickup there just by keeping him. This is a really good Rangers squad. I think there's a lot of questions about the blue line, how things are going to pan out with Lundqvist and Schneider, and kind of how the trickle effect of the depth is moving forward. But I still like that Rangers group. They've got a good group up front. The kid line was great for them during the playoffs last year. We need to see that scoring continue from Panarin and Kreider and Zibanejad. If that continues, the Rangers are going to be a top-tier team in that Eastern Conference. Not just the division, the conference overall. The Rangers are going to be able to get some wins just off Shesterkin, just being Shesterkin. But as long as the Rangers can continue to score goals and buy into what again, they kind of struggled toward the end of the regular season. They stopped with that defensive structure that they had that was so good. As long as they can continue to buy into that defense and that system that Gallant brought, they're going to be a great team again next season, and kind of showing what he did in Vegas and Florida in his most recent team. So we'll see what happens there. Number 6 is the Toronto Maple Leafs. So everybody is kind of dogging on the Leafs, right? Freddie Anderson goes out the door. Peter Mrazek goes out the door. Jack Campbell. They've lost a couple of goalies over the last couple of years. But Matt Murray came in, and that's not the guy I'm talking about. I think Ilya Samsonov, hot take, Ilya Samsonov becomes the starting goaltender on Game 1 of the Stanley Cup playoffs next year for the Toronto Maple Leafs. So I have them making the playoffs, and I have him starting Game 1. I think Samsonov is going to be that goalie that maybe he kind of has been waiting to become. I don't think Washington gave him enough of a chance. Now, hopefully, Samsonov might make me eat my own words, and he ends up being terrible next season. But I think that the blue line is continuing to mature there in Toronto. That's been one of their weaknesses. But I do still think the Leafs have a really good group there. Morgan Riley, Jake Muzzin, TJ Brody, Justin Hall, Timothy Liljegren, Mark Giordano, and as long as they re-sign Rasmus Sandin, I think they've got a pretty good group there. I'm not liking this team because of Murray. I like it because of Samsonov and what I think he can provide. He's still 25 years old. He hasn't even hit his prime yet. Expect a bounce-back season for Samsonov and potentially a big ticket next season. Listen, I'm usually the first guy to give heat to Kyle Dubas. I think that was a great pickup, bringing in the Russian goaltender. They've added a little bit of Schnarl to their group, bringing in a guy like Clifford, Joey Anderson, Adam Gaudette. I really like additions like Aube Kubel, and Kalle Jarnkrok is a guy that can play in the playoffs. We saw what he did in Nashville a couple years ago, and he had a decent season considering how things ended up in Seattle last year. So I think he's a guy to really keep an eye on there. Watch out for the Leafs. I think they're due for a good season this year, and specifically Ilya Samsonov. Number 5 is the Carolina Hurricanes. So the Carolina Hurricanes, kind of similar to my hopes of the Islanders being a good playoff team. The goalie tandem in Carolina, as long as they stay healthy, Freddie Anderson and Antti Ranta, that is top tier in the league, and it's really hard to argue that. Carolina is going to be a great team this year. Yes, maybe their defense isn't what it was last season, but it's still very good. Ian Cole is no longer there. Tony DeAngelo is no longer there, but that's why you bring in new additions. And I don't think Carolina got too banged up in that department. I really like some of their additions. Again, they weren't the sexy additions. You bring in Brent Burns from San Jose and Max Pacioretty. Pacioretty, I think he's going to be the guy that has been training the hardest this offseason. He wants to prove to Vegas that they screwed up getting rid of him. He led the Vegas Golden Knights in goals last season. Take with that what you will, but he led the team in points last year, and Carolina basically got him for nothing. So I think Carolina is due for a great season again. And I think this is a year, if Rod Brind'Amour, he might have that magic to get them back to the conference finals this year. A big season for some of those goalies like Anderson and Ranta. They're in their mid-30s. I expect them to be kind of looking for that last dance run. I think this is a big year for the Carolina Hurricanes. Potentially conference final run. So shout out there. I think they're going to be a team to watch for this year. Number 4, we're heading to Alberta. And that's the Calgary Flames. Everybody's been dogging Calgary. They lost Tkachuk. They lost Goodbranson, maybe to a lesser extent. They lost Matthew Tkachuk, Johnny Gaudreau, Goodbranson. They're done. You're wrong. You're just flat out wrong. You look at this team 1-for-1 for the guys that they lost and brought in. So you lose, not even trade, right? I would take this trade any day. So you trade out Matthew Tkachuk, Johnny Gaudreau, and Eric Goodbranson, okay? And Sean Monahan. Okay, Sean Monahan is in there as well. And he was bad for them last year. So take with that what you will. You bring in Nazem Kadri, Jonathan Huberdeau, and I think this is the one, and some of you have mentioned in the comments, everybody's forgetting about Mackenzie Wieger here. Mackenzie Wieger is a huge addition. He's a way better player than Eric Goodbranson was, and if he's playing on that pair with Zadorov next season, Zadorov and Wieger next year might be the best second pairing in the National Hockey League on a blue line next year. And call me crazy for that. Again, I've had a couple takes here, but I think Wieger and Zadorov could end up being a monster shutdown pairing. And I think if they've got that healthy group going into the playoffs next year, and under Daryl Sutter's watch, keep an eye out for Calgary. I said they would go to the Stanley Cup final last year. I think as long as they stay healthy. Markstrom even said he thinks this team is better than they were last year, and I kind of agree with him here. Watch out for the Calgary Flames. I think they were burned, pun intended. I think they were burned with how things ended against Edmonton last year. Shout out there. I think Calgary will definitely be a team to watch for next season. Number 3 is, of course, the other team in Alberta. So we got a couple Alberta teams here. Talk about the rivalry there. The Battle of Alberta, top 4 teams in the National Hockey League. I'm ready for that once again this year. It's the Edmonton Oilers, of course. And, maybe that puts a little bit of water on the Flames kind of fire here. Man, I'm killing it with the puns here at the end of today's video. But the Oilers are still a great team. I think they're a team that, if you want to talk about, did they get the final piece? I think their biggest weakness was addressed, right? You could argue their defense, and a lot of you Oilers fans have said that. You're not a fan of the blue line. I agree. Is it Stanley Cup champion caliber defense? No. They obviously have the talent up front with the two-headed monster of Draisaitl and McDavid, but they're even more than that, and they showed that last year. I think Kailer Yamamoto getting that extension. I don't know what's going to happen with Puljujarvi, but we'll see what happens there. You still have some pretty good players on the blue line, right? You still have Darnell Nurse, who I think is pretty good, maybe overpaid, but still a good defenseman. I think Philip Broberg could end up being a top 4 defenseman by the end of the season, as long as they play him. And Jack Campbell coming in between the pipes is just massive for the Edmonton Oilers. I really think that is a huge boost to them. But he has to stay healthy. If they have to go to Stuart Skinner for any reason, not to diminish Stuart Skinner here, but that really hurts them if Jack Campbell gets hurt. He's proven that he could play in Toronto a lot of minutes, but again, consistently for year after year. I have my concerns about that 5-over-5 deal, but we'll see how things play out. I'm drinking the Kool-Aid in Edmonton. We'll see if it bites me in the ass, but I really like what I've seen from them so far. Now, obviously, we go to the top two, and this is one of those things where it's kind of, until they prove otherwise, they are still the top two teams in the NHL. And at number 2 is the Tampa Bay Lightning. The Tampa Bay Lightning, again, it kind of speaks for itself. They won back-to-back Stanley Cups, got to the Stanley Cup final for the last 3 straight seasons. The top team beat them pretty good, let's be honest, but they still got to the final 3 straight seasons. Tampa Bay is just a really good team, and again, defense wins championships and goaltending steals games. Their goalie, Vasilevsky, can steal a heck of a lot of games during the regular season. He gets at least 40, he gets between 40 and 50 wins every season the last 4 or 5 years, and I expect that to continue. He's going to be a Vezina finalist next year. I'm pinning that one in as long as he stays healthy. Tampa's going to be a contender again next year. Even with Palat gone, this team is still very good. Maybe not next year, but we're still a year away from that. Tampa will still be a good team this year. I don't think they're going to fall off quite yet. And of course, that means at number 1, again, until they are proven otherwise, the Colorado Avalanche are the top team in the National Hockey League. They won the Stanley Cup, obviously, so it's kind of hard to argue that they aren't the number 1 team. They're kind of on top of the world this summer, but they did have a couple of guys that left, which means we're going to see more of the youth movement in Colorado. Nazem Kadri, no longer there. Darcy Kemper, no longer there. But they did keep a couple of pretty important pieces to this team. Val Nichushkin returned, which is a pretty nice addition. Well, I guess kind of a guy that you keep in the sense. They also kept Arturi Lehkonen on a nice extension. They also kept Josh Manson, who was rumored to be leaving the team. He decided to not test free agency, decided to stick around. Alexander Georgiev was really one of the only real additions to the team this year in between the pipes. I'm not necessarily sold on him, but again, that defense is just so good, it doesn't really matter, and I hate to even say that, but with Makar, Johnson, Gerard, Manson, the fact that Tays is 5th on that defense is disgusting, but Devon Tays, Curtis McDermott, oh yeah, remember Bowen Byram? The kid that was pretty good? Yeah, he's also there, and Andreas Englund, take with that what you will, but they've got a really good hockey team. Shout out to Joe Sakic, and now the new general manager. There's going to be a new GM there in Colorado. Chris McFarland, shout out to him. So there's going to be a new test for the Colorado Avalanche, but I do think they are still the best team. And as long as they assign Nathan McKinnon next year, that's kind of a next year problem, but the Colorado Avalanche are still the best team in the National Hockey League. So guys, that is it for our preseason power rankings. Like I said at the beginning of the video, guys, stay tuned. Every Friday at 10 a.m. Eastern, we are going to be doing a weekly live Goal Line Hockey power ranking, so stay tuned for that. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you guys again next time.